Welcome, everyone, to the first KVRU 105.7 FM Public Forum. Thank you very much for coming. I'm Sharon, Maeda, Station Manager, and we look to have a very interesting 2 hours of discussion tonight. Jenny Durkan is going to have to leave after the first hour, so we've changed up the format a little bit, and at the end of the first hour, they will make their closing, both of them will make their closing remarks. So without further ado, we didn't do the coin toss.
All right, you go first.
All right, candidate Cary Moon will begin. You may use that microphone or you can use this one.
We can do duet.
It is great to be here. Thank you, everyone, for coming out to be part of this forum. I'm excited because it's 7 against 2. This should be really interesting. I am Cary Moon. I am running for mayor of Seattle because I believe in the potential of this city. We have incredible resources. We have a spirit of innovation and creativity like no place else. We have shared progressive values. We have tremendous wealth, and we have such a diversity of cultures in our city. But we are at stake of losing all of that because our city is becoming unaffordable. Our economy is building tremendous wealth for the lucky few while everybody else is slipping beneath the surface. We need bold leadership. We need strong, bold solutions. We need somebody ready to hit the ground running in City Hall and build momentum and commitment from the 11,000 employees in the city towards being a city that's inclusive, welcoming, diverse, creative, and committed to shared prosperity. I'm excited about working together with all of you on that. More time? Okay. Getting very confusing messages over here. I'm really excited to work with all of you on that because I believe that between the communities, between the folks who work in the city, and between what we understand about what we want to be in our future, we can build commitment, we can build momentum, and we can actually implement the solutions that we need to tackle all the crises I talked about earlier. So thanks for being here tonight. I look forward to the dialogue, and let's get started.
Jenny Durkan.
And how much time is it?
3 minutes.
2 minutes.
See, 2 or 3.
Wait a minute, how much did you give Cary?
She did 45 seconds.
Okay, so 2 minutes.
Do you want 15 more seconds, Cary? Come on.
Later.
You get a whole hour without me. That seems fair. So I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. It's so great to be here. I think this is our 3rd time down here this week. And it's great that this is one of the big kickoffs for the radio station. Sharon, congratulations on that.
Thank you.
What a great place to have this kind of format towards the end of election. Our city has changed so rapidly. You know, I was fortunate. I was born and raised here. My mom grew up here, and I've raised my 2 sons here. But if you look at what's happened to Seattle just in the last 5 years, it has changed as a city before our eyes. We really are tearing down the city and rebuilding it overnight. And in neighborhoods like around here, Central District and Rainier Valley, people have been pushed out. City is just not affordable. You can't afford to stay in Seattle because property taxes are going so high. And if you're coming to Seattle, you can't get into Seattle because it's so expensive. The homeless problem we've talked about is really a heartbreaking one, and one that I think defines our city in ways that it shouldn't. We're the most prosperous city in the most prosperous country, maybe in the history of the world. And yet we have people living on our streets, in cars, and in doorways. I think we can do better. Our transportation system is a mess, and our country is really at a crossroads. Nothing good is going to come out of Washington, D.C. in the next 2 years. Nothing good. We're going to have to spend energy fending them off, and we are going to have to lead. because leadership is going to come from the states and cities, and I believe it'll come from right here. I think we're up to this challenge. I think this election is not about who will be mayor for 4 years. It's about what will the city be like for the next generation. Will we reclaim neighborhoods like around here and make sure people can live in them? Will we have a future that is better for climate than the one we have today? Will we have a transportation system that is built on buses and light rail and get people out of single occupancy vehicles? But mostly, will we be that city that is inclusive, diverse, and welcoming? I'd love to be that mayor. Thank you.
We have a distinguished group of panelists that will be asking questions. 4 are journalists, 3 are former candidates in the primary of this mayoral election. The 4th one, Bob Hasagawa, declined to participate. So, we will begin with Julie Pham, PhD, who is the co-owner of the Northwest Vietnamese News, former director of CB's, a shared news service for ethnic communities, and she currently works in the technology industry. Julie?
Hi, thank you. So we hear a lot about how if we just bring more people to the table, get all these voices to the table, then we will have a solution. The problem is you can have all these voices at the table, and if there's no clear decision-making process, then a lot of people feel unsatisfied and disenchanted, and they may not want to come back. So could you talk about a time where when you were handling a divisive issue and you were able to reach out to communities that might normally not participate, and there was not going to be, you knew that there was not going to be, consensus was not going to be possible?
Just so we have it clear this time, there's 1 minute for each of you to answer, and we'll start with Jenny.
Can I just use this mic?
Sure.
Rather than do that up and down thing. So that's a great question, and I will use an example of police reform. So when I was United States Attorney, we saw video after video in this city of people being abused by the police, usually young men of color, and then John T. Williams was killed in the streets. We knew we had to do something different. So we started an investigation with the Department of Justice, but we couldn't just investigate, we had to reach out to communities all over the city, in the north end, the south end, and hear from people and get people to talk. It required going to communities needing translators, listening to people. Sometimes they didn't want us, the Department of Justice, there, so we had to have credible messengers. Then we would bring people together to say, okay, as we move forward, what are some of the solutions and requirements we will need in the consent decree? We also reached out to the police department, line officers, management, and the like. It was hard, but at the end, we had to have a process in place, not just to talk and not just for process, but to actually get something done, which was the consent decree, and I think brought all those voices together.
So I'll talk about a slightly sideways story that I think gets at the answer you're looking for. I have been part of a group called Progress Alliance, which is a donor alliance that invests in progressive infrastructure in our state. And like most organizations led by wealthy white people, we thought we knew everything. We thought we had the best strategy, the best theory of change. We knew how to make a better state. And I, along with 2 staff members, really pushed for rethinking how we operate. And we went through an intense, long racial equity training and realized we were doing everything wrong. And we completely zeroed out our budget, really thought about systemic racism in this city, and rearranged how we do our funding to invest in empowering communities and building capacity, building voice, building power in communities. Because long-term, that is how we're going to change systemic racism in this city. And we have got to shift our model in government in the same way to change how we're investing, how we're empowering folks, and how we are listening to folks and being accountable to them.
All right. Our next question will be asked by Jezen Farrell. She's the former representative from the 46th Legislative District and was also a candidate for mayor earlier this year.
Good evening, everyone, and good evening, Jenny and Cary. It's nice to be up here with you again.
And to answer the questions.
No, it's quite nice to be up here with you again, actually, from this perspective. Hello, Nikita. So my question is, we are, of course, in the Trump era, and where we are really under a true threat of fascism. And on the one hand, it is strong institutions like a strong judiciary or strong legislatures that are able to fight and defend from the federal government. At the same time, we have institutions that are deeply failing members of our community, whether it's education or criminal justice. And so I'm curious, as mayor, how you do both. On the one hand, strengthen and fight for institutions that are under attack, and on the other hand, transform institutions that are failing people. And if you could answer the question, maybe pick an institution specifically that you might want to, on the one hand, strengthen and protect from attack, but at the same time, transform.
So that's a hard question, Justin. So I would talk about the whole city, because I think that in this time of fear, when there's so much good stuff being dismantled and so many scary things rising in power, like fascism, authoritarianism, I think the way you get through that is by naming a future vision, laying out the action plan to get there, and invite everybody to be part of the solution. Because if we are fearful, if we are hunkered down trying to protect our private interests, that's when we're weak. It's when we are unified, when we are fighting together towards a better possible future, that we are strong, because we have momentum, we have energy, we have locked arms together with one another towards what we're trying to achieve, and that's what we need to do in our city. And I think we've lost our way. We haven't had a vision. We're dealing with all this flux and transformation. No one knows where we're headed, and that is why we've had so much infighting and arguing. I believe we need to pull together towards a better possible future, with the mayor leading that and championing that vision.
So that is a great question, and I really believe that we are the leadership we need. We have an obligation, not just to our community, but I think to the country, to show how leadership can be done and show how we can both protect what we care about and transfer those things that need to be transformed. So in protecting what we care about, I actually did that when the Trump Muslim ban came down. The day it came down, I drove to the airport, and working with civil rights organizations, was able to get one of the first court orders to prevent someone from being deported. I couldn't have done it alone. I did it because I was standing with others. That's transformation and protection. We have to be able to lead on climate change, on wage disparity. We can show that we can have an honest conversation in the city about race and how institutional racism has led to the lack of opportunity in much of our community, and then we can transform that with real live economic opportunity. So I think that we both can protect and transform, and that Seattle can be the leader on these issues.
All right, before we go to the next question, I do want to thank the Rainier Arts Center, the space that we are in. It is a sister program of SEED Arts, which is part of SEED, Southeast Effective Development, that's been here in the Rainier Valley for the past, I don't know how many years, since 1975. And we want to thank them for allowing us to use the space free of charge. And also thanks very much to the crew from Jack Straw Cultural Center, who is helping us with the recordings tonight. Next, this person needs no real introduction. Mike McGinn was mayor of Seattle from 2010 through 2013, community and environmental activist, and a candidate again this year. Mike?
Thank you, and thanks for doing this, Sharon, and thank you to the radio station. So in the forums, everybody, learns the words to say and the values to express about, what Seattle is and what they believe in. But from my experience, once you're in office, you get to a point where issues come at you and you can't wave the magic wand of getting everybody to agree on what the right solution is, and you have to make a choice. You have to pick a side. I had to with the anti-panhandling statute, and with paid sick leave. Two council members have introduced in this budget season what's being called an employee hours tax or a head tax. It's a tax on businesses that make more than, I think, $5 million a year in revenue. It'll be a tax per employee. There will be a vote on that, and the dollars will be used to help get people into shelter and build affordable housing and reduce the need or eliminate the sweeps. So my question is, this is an issue that it would be coming at you as mayor, and it's certainly in front of the civic life right now. Do you support taxing large corporations in order for them to pay for homeless services and housing?
And I assume you're asking in the context of the proposed legislation itself, or just generally?
No, the proposed legislation, and then more generally, if you want to expand.
Great.
Absolutely.
So I think that Cary and I have actually expressed very similar views on this in forums, which is taxing corporations. When we approach that, we have to make sure that we are not taxing small businesses. And sometimes the dollar amount, including the dollar amount that's been proposed by the two council members, actually will bring in small businesses, because our B&O tax is based upon gross revenues, and it is not based upon profit. So if you have a high grossing business, whether it's a manufacturing business or a restaurant, you actually can be grossing the amount that would bring you up, and then there would be double taxation. So I want to look at what the cutoffs are and make sure that we're not impacting. I'm not necessarily opposed to a tax on corporations if it can do more funding. I've said consistently in this election that I want to hold off on any new taxes until I'm sure that the budget we have is not sufficient to meet what we need. The one area I've talked about, and why I was very glad to see that this is where the two council members were pointed, is in the area of homelessness, and particularly in drug addiction services and mental health services. That's where I think we're going to need more revenues, and I'll look at all options.
So if you know anything about my activism in the city, you know this about me, that I am not afraid to say difficult things to powerful people, whether that's fighting for a transit-based solution instead of a bypass highway on the waterfront, or whether it's calling on Ed Murray to step down months ago. I have a strong backbone, and I am ready to push for both the high earners income tax and tax on large corporations, because we absolutely know that the problem we have in our city, one of the main problems, is that too few people have access to power in City Hall. We are listening to lobbyists and corporate special interest and blocking progress on solutions we know we all need. So absolutely, I would work to refine the head tax, make sure we're only taxing the top few percentage of businesses, not all the small businesses that need help, not more taxes. But absolutely, I would push forward with taxing corporations, taxing high earners, because we simply need more revenue for the solutions we all know are necessary.
I think you've seen a pattern here in who the journalists are who are here. We quite intentionally invited community journalists who work here in Southeast Seattle. And the next journalist is Chaitanya Robinson, who is the associate editor of the International Examiner, Seattle's nonprofit Asian Pacific Islander news source since 1974.
Hello. I have a question which is of particular concern to people in the Chinatown International International District, but throughout the city. And the question is about the Mandatory Housing Affordability Policy, or MHA. This is a policy that allows developers to build taller projects in exchange for setting aside some percentage of housing as affordable or paying into an affordable housing fund. Many people are concerned that this does not go far enough and that it will lead to an increase in development that is not affordable for low-income communities. People are concerned that it will contribute to displacement of people, businesses, and nonprofits. My question is, do you agree that the MHA requirements, the mandatory housing affordability requirements, do not go far enough to prevent displacement? If so, what would you do as mayor to help protect against displacement?
So I agree with you that they don't go far enough to protect against displacement, that it's true. When you offer an upzone, it causes speculation, it causes property values to rise, and people to be pushed out of neighborhoods. And while the MHA upzone are a good tool, they're one of many tools we should be looking at for adding increased affordability in neighborhoods, especially in the South End. So I would sit down with community groups and say, we're trying to add this much more housing in your neighborhood. Here are all the tools that we could be using, whether it's doing stacked flats or row houses or duplexes or backyard cottages or mandatory housing affordability upzones in certain parts in the urban village, expanding the urban village. I would sit down with the neighborhood, look at all the tools that do the best to bring affordable housing without destroying the culture or the character. And places like Chinatown ID are incredibly fragile. This is an ecosystem of community, and we absolutely can't afford to make a mistake because it's a treasure, it's part of our soul in Seattle, and it's important to protect the folks who live there.
So we're in a housing crisis. We need more affordable housing. I was talking to an Amazon employee last week as part of an endorsement interview, and he was, I think it was employee number 13,000. And they're now up to employee number 50,000 or something like that. We have over 40,000 Amazon employees making over $100,000 a year. That's about $40 million a year being pumped into our economy that can go to housing that most people in the South End just can't compete with because those jobs have not been spread throughout our city. We need more housing, and one of the only ways we can do it is through the MHA agreement, because that's the way we get developers to pay for the affordable housing. It's not enough, it doesn't go far enough, and we have to watch on how it does on displacement, because I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all for any neighborhood on how we do upzones. As I've done business walking tours, I've actually walked with upzone maps, and sometimes you can see why, we can put a taller building here, but not there. So I think we have to be very sensitive to international district and other districts like that have historical importance, but we have to have the MHA to meet our goals.
The next person to ask questions is Sofia Abunie. She is a volunteer at the Multimedia Resource and Training Institute that works with East African youth and young adults to train them in media production. They have a regular show on cable TV. And Sofia is on her way to medical school, actually, but in the meantime, she's volunteering to help these young folks have their own voice.
Hi. My question is regarding small minority businesses such as MMRTI, which is the Multimedia Resource and Training Institute, which is also a nonprofit organization and a voice for the African American community and the East African immigrants in the area. They're moving out towards the end of the year from the Central District due to gentrification. And what is your view or plans to address that issue?
I think this is one of the critical issues that the next mayor is facing, and we have to take action and very intentional action, both for small businesses and to fight gentrification, and those have a little bit different strategies. So on the small business, what we have seen is the economic vitality has drained out of the Central District and Rainier Valley, largely after I-200, which was the anti-affirmative action initiative that we had here. And before that passed, something around 20 or more % of public dollars actually went to minority businesses. There was a study 2 weeks ago by the State Department of Transportation. It's less than 1% now. And the businesses hurt the most are African American businesses. So I have promised if I am mayor, I am going to be very forward-leaning and make sure that we actually put money into the pockets of minority businesses. I'm not afraid of I-200. We have a disparity study that we can do it now. And I think we have to build up wealth. On gentrification, we have to have more projects like Africatown that really are going to honor the community, controlled by the community, and then you have other ones like, I'm getting the stop sign. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, I think we often talk about gentrification like it's just something that happens and we don't know why and we don't know how and we're all victims to it. We've got to reverse that way of looking at it. Gentrification is intentional. Gentrification is a policy that says whoever has the most money wins. And the city needs to do a much better job working with communities to protect what's important to the community, protect the capacity for the community to own property, own businesses, own housing in community, because we know long-term that's how you keep intergenerational wealth, that's how you keep economic security and resilience. So we need to do a much more intentional job and not be so laissez-faire about letting people just come in and invade and push out existing communities. So the Liberty Bank project is a great model. We have about 8 other projects in the pipeline that would like to do what El Centro de la Raza did or Liberty Bank is doing. The city needs to be at the table, creating those agreements, community benefit agreements, putting together those deals. That's the only way we're going to stop this.
Okay, next is Sharon Lane, who writes about Seattle City Council and Seattle issues for the South Seattle Emerald. Sharon?
Thank you. This question is mainly for Jenny Durkan before you have to run, but Cary Moon is welcome to comment as well. Jenny, conversations in the community or word on the street is that you have often been labeled the business as usual candidate who has a history of not being firmly rooted in principle and changing position based on what's popular, most recently being late to ask for Ed Murray's resignation and having a long list of wealthy donors. What is your response to these critiques?
I'm really glad you asked that, because you hear that different kinds of word on the street, and the best answers are the people who support me. I am really proud that I have over 3,400 people who have stepped up and supported my campaign. And people like Cary Moon always want to point to big corporations. Less than 1% of the people who have contributed my campaign are companies. 99% of them are individuals. And I've had volunteers out every weekend in every part of this town. And those volunteers come from every part of this town. And they have knocked on thousands of doors and made thousands of calls, which I have too. And I think the best guide to what someone will do as a mayor is what they've done in the past. And I would ask you or anyone I'd sit and talk to you about over the last 30 years what I've done to stand up for principle, because that's who I am. I stood up for years for LGBTQ rights when it was hard and when we didn't have many allies doing it. And yes, it was for myself because I was gay, but it was for others too. I also was not afraid to stand up to the police department and to Mayor Mike McGinn when we needed police reform. And I just posted today on Medium to remind people what it was really like in this town after person was beaten by the police and no one was doing anything about it. And I was able to work with community groups under a lot of pressure. And I'm not afraid to stand up to anyone, and I will do that for the city every day.
Okay, so you have about 30 seconds extra if you'd like to answer that.
Okay. So, I'm a first-time candidate. I have been an activist and a planner in this town for 20 years, but I haven't run for office before. And as anybody can tell you, there's a steep hill to climb. If you're a brilliant community activist like Nikita Oliver, who's an educator and has such strong networks in this community, you can activate those networks and build a strong grassroots campaign, which she did beautifully and effectively, and working with People's Party to create a much better city and balance power in City Hall and build black and brown power in this city. For someone like me in a field of 21 candidates, I didn't come to this with Ed Murray's donor list and Ed Murray's political machine. I didn't come with a background of community support, but I am working so hard to build that right now. And I believe, in our office we joke that the Chamber of Commerce contribution to Jenny's campaign, or her independent expenditure, $525,000, we call that the $525,000 panic button, because they are afraid of sharing power across race and class and gender, as I've promised. They want to keep the status quo, and I think that's what we should be focused on.
I need to respond to that, because if we're going to do this fairly, I think it's time to be able to respond to that directly, because if you look at who has funded their campaign with what, I was a first-time candidate, and I had no donor list. And in the first weeks of my campaign, I had enormous response from across this city. But one thing I haven't done with my wealth is fund my own campaign. And Cary Moon has spent hundreds of thousands of dollars of her own money she got from a family corporation that then had, where everyone lost their job. So let's at least be honest about who is stepping up and getting support from other people, because I'm proud of all the unions that are supporting me, the workers that are supporting me, and the 3,400 people who've stepped up to support my campaign.
So, as a person, I grew up middle class. Yes, I had privileges. Many doors were open to me, and I own that privilege. But yes, we built a successful family business that shared profits and shared ownership with the employees. And after my parents died, I did inherit some money. And I would like to ask everybody in this room to imagine what you would do if you were lucky like that. I have spent the last 5 years devoting my time, my resources, my energy, and my capacity towards building a better future city in Seattle. Because I'm committed to this place, and I want to do everything I can out of a sense of duty and responsibility to build a better city. So yes, I own the privilege, but I want you to understand it as an investment in the future of our city, because I believe it's my responsibility, and I believe that changing power in this city is part of the solution, and I'm happy to invest in that.
Before we go to the next question, I just want to alert the panelists that we have a little bit of extra time, so I am going to ask for about 4 more questions after the next one. So the next panelist needs no introduction. Nikita Oliver, she's an artist, educator, and attorney, and ran for mayor as well. She was here a little late because tonight she just received a Social Justice Award from the Columbia Legal Services. And she was kind enough to race over here and leave her own banquet. And so, Nikita, your question.
So as you can imagine, I had quite a few questions I wanted to ask. I want to acknowledge that today there was a decision made around Sky Chef to give back the wages that those workers deserved, but to give a slap on the wrist to a corporation that is brutalizing workers in our city. That's the question I was going to ask, but while I was sitting here listening to you all talk, I was thinking about the question that I keep getting repeatedly asked, even though I'm no longer in the race, which is, which candidate will you endorse, Nikita? And my answer continues to be that I won't endorse either. And it has been something that myself and the People's Party have taken quite a bit of ridicule for, because people believe it is our job to direct our voters to the candidate that will represent them. And if I'm frank, the communities that I represent do not believe that either of you will do more than make platitudes and campaign promises. So if the question of who I should endorse were posed to you, what would you actually say outside of campaign platitudes? What practical solutions would you offer to the 31,000 plus people who voted for myself and the Seattle People's Party?
Yeah. Right on. Because this is it. This is where the rubber hits the road. We know in our city that white people show up, politicians show up down south every 4 years, make all the promises, use all the pretty words, and then never come back. So my commitment is to make sure that we are sharing power across race, class, and gender in the mayor's office, in all departmental leadership teams, and in every board and commission in the city, because that's the first step, is to have people at the table and hear them and let them shape solutions together. Second, use the racial equity lens in every allocation of resources, because that's the other ugly side of systemic racism, is you have a seat at the table, but oh, sorry, we ran out of money. We can't really invest in your projects. So we've got to use the racial equity lens for all allocation of funding. Third, we've got to use the race and social justice toolkit and double down to make sure we're actually using it to make decisions in how we implement the policies of the city. So that is my commitment. My commitment is to be available, to hold myself accountable, to have your people in my office holding me accountable, and I've already started on that process by offering you 2 seats on the transition team, and I will keep going, showing that I'm accountable, because I believe in this change too.
So I think the real question is not will you show up and how will you use your privilege. I think the test is have you shown up and how have you used your privilege. I don't deny that I have had incredible privilege in my life, but I've been showing up in this community for a long time, for 30 years. You know, I started as a criminal defense lawyer representing mostly people of color when we had the failed war on drugs and had a front line to seeing how the whole community was being devastated by the drugs and by the criminal justice response. I fought for treatment alternatives instead of incarceration alternatives. As Barack Obama's United States Attorney for the Western District of Washington, I not only started one of the first federal drug courts so people could get treatment instead of being put in jail, I also founded a civil rights division right here to go against housing discrimination and every other kind of discrimination. We went from 1 case to 100 cases. And then I did the hard work of police reform, not alone, never alone, and we're not done yet. But if you want to know who will show up, you should look at who's already shown up.
All right, who over on this side has a second question? Come on, let's not all. Julie, go ahead.
Okay, the one, Seattle process, good, bad, needed. What's your comment?
Needed, but you got to have an end to it.
So I think when we're aiming towards an identified goal, it's great. When we're having an open process where people show up, that invites people who have complaints, who want to talk about their own private interests and want to get something from the city. That doesn't work, because that's when you devolve into everybody arguing, polarizing, and protecting private interests. So as long as we are aiming towards a constructive future goal and inviting people to contribute constructive answers, it's great. We invented neighborhood planning. I think we need to bring back a 21st century version of neighborhood planning, because people in this city feel we have a right to shape our destiny. To me, it's one of the most fundamental human rights to decide how we want to live in relation to one another, what kind of economic system we want to participate in. And if you don't have neighborhood planning, if you don't have dialogue about that, we are leaving it to the most powerful, the people who can show up, the people who can pay lobbyists, the people who know how the halls of government work, and that's where you get the problems that we have now. So absolutely yes, process, but well designed.
Shatanya, Jeslyn, anybody have a question over there? Go ahead.
In Seattle, the impacts of pollution on people are most strongly felt in South Seattle, in communities that are mostly low income and disproportionately communities of color. The EPA right now is no longer interested in supporting environmental justice projects. Given this, what would you do as mayor to mitigate the disproportionate impacts of pollution on low-income communities and communities of color?
So you're right, and this is completely unconscionable in our city. The life expectancy for someone who lives in South Park is 13 years less than someone who lives in Laurelhurst. That's right here in our own city because of pollution. So we need to work with the Alliance for Jobs and Clean Energy, Got Green, and all the organizations that are already leading in the city on environmental justice, who have laid out the path there. Because, you know, when we treat climate like it's an issue that's about the polar bears, or it's about, you know, this big lofty goal of, you know, 2 degrees or whatever the right number is, 1.5 degrees, we lose people. If we talk about pollution, if we talk about health, if we talk about kids' asthma rates, if we talk about life expectancy, if we talk about the immediate impacts of climate change, then we can unify together around shared goals and shared solutions. So I would totally work with the Alliance for Clean Jobs and Energy, work with all the organizations already in the environmental justice field in this city, and make sure we are centering their voices and their solutions as we pursue climate justice in our city.
I think you put your hand on one of the things that is not getting enough press in terms of what the changes at the EPA. I had the opportunity to work with Lisa Jackson, who was Barack Obama's first director of the EPA, and she was making great strides in environmental justice. She thought she had embedded it well enough and had U.S. attorneys throughout the country bringing those cases, but we've seen now it being dismantled. It will fall to not just our city, but our state. So I think we have to join with Jay Inslee and County Executive Dow Constantine to see if we can have a regional response and direct more dollars and more fairness to those cities, because there is no question that it has been poor people who have borne the environmental damage more than others. And if you look some of the models there are, I think that, there's a good chance we'll get a carbon tax next year. If we do, I would argue that a good portion of that has to go directly to those communities who have been disproportionately affected by the bad environmental impacts. And that's up and down, it's the Duwamish, it's South Park and areas like that. I think we can make progress on it. Sorry, Sharon.
So, Mike, you have a question?
So, in response to an earlier question, you said that 1% of your donations had come from corporations. And the last I saw, you had raised approximately $800,000. I also saw the Chamber of Commerce independent expenditure is going to put in over $500,000 into a campaign. Isn't $500,000 more than 1% of $800,000?
Yes, and as Mike knows, that unfortunately under independent exposure, I have no control over it. They're not to my campaigns. We can't control, and I've called for them not to do it. I've publicly said I wish you would not raise money, and I hope you don't spend it. All I can control is my own campaign. I think we should also note, so people know, Mike McGinn has endorsed Cary Moon, has been at many functions supporting her and tweeting for her, and so he's not exactly your neutral panelist here. But the real question again is, if we want to get money out of politics, we should have everyone have to raise the money and go out and the community did it. And I've worked hard to do that and have been very pleased by the response. And my donors have come from every part of the city. More important, my volunteers who can't give money have come from every part of the city. And there's hundreds of them on the weekends, in the rain, knocking on doors. I am super proud of that. And while we are both very wealthy women, Cary Moon and I've put $400 in. She's put hundreds of thousands of dollars in that if she didn't spend, it would probably be Nikita Oliver and I sitting here, and she'd be on that panel.
I'm not going to comment on this. I'll save my extra minute for another answer, because I would like to hear if Nikita wants to speak. Please do. If you don't, that's fine too. Because it's uncomfortable for me to see you being used. And so I'd like to hear what you have to say.
Thank you. I do have a question, if that's okay, Sharon.
Sure.
So my question is around, so in the courts, there's this idea called judicial notice, which means suddenly new information has come up and there's something new that the court should consider. I bring that up because I think about things like the youth jail and how over the past few years, communities have had to rise up and tell our story time and time again, kind of as a judicial notice, although I think the information's been out there. To let politicians know why we take such issue with the building of a new jail. Over time, some politicians have actually changed their story and said, we'd like to do something different because now this information has actually really got to us and we think we can make a better plan. What I want to know is there a time in your work, since we're talking about track records, when you did something that harmed a community or was a mistake, and what would you have done differently? I think an important mark of a strong leader is our willingness to admit when maybe we've been going down the wrong path and how we will transition to one that actually honors the most impacted in our city.
So if you don't mind, I'd like to just talk about the youth jail itself, because I was one of those voters who was barely paying attention, and I saw the paid media and the paid marketing for the proponents of the project and didn't understand that it was all dishonest and all a lie. So I did vote for it. And because of EPIC, because of Block the Bunker, because of Black Lives Matter, because of the, all the organizations that were fighting against the youth jail, I recognized I was wrong, and I have become a vocal opponent of this. So I would make sure, I think, what do I want to say? So I will own that mistake, and I will do the same as mayor, because I think sometimes you get more information and you realize you were wrong. And so for the youth jail, I would keep fighting for rescoping that project. Yes, we need a new building, but it needs to be truly devoted to restorative justice, diversion programs, and caring for young people, and not for incarcerating them. So I will keep pushing to rescope, redesign that project, and go back to the voters.
So I think that's a really good and insightful question. I will say that my most truthful answer would be probably in the area of the youth jail. You've heard me answer at other forums about that, and my initial take was, and parts of it I still really believe, which is the current facility, I think, is reprehensible and screams to children, you don't matter. And we've done better at moving those detention numbers down. And I believe strongly in the restorative justice programs, and have worked with the courts and talked about what kind of programs need to be there to really disrupt it. But I was not as thoughtful as I needed to be on the system itself, and have spent the last many weeks actually sitting down and talking to people like at Team Child, with families, with the court, and with council members and the like. And we need to do better, particularly on detention predisposition, because kids of color don't have the advantage that other kids have, and they're being detained when they shouldn't be. And so that's an issue that I want to continue to work with everyone so that we can do better on that. And I was too hasty in my response.
Sophia, do you have a question?
Okay, something that goes on in my community, but do you have any suggestions for after-school programs? Because you just mentioned about the youth and youth jail, that could keep them, engaged in the community, or busy, really.
Yeah, I think that is, one of the great programs I was able to be involved in when I was U.S. Attorney was the Youth Violence Prevention Initiative. And then I was, at the beginning of this campaign, returned and sat down with the folks at Rainier Beach to see how things were going. And they've developed some fantastic programs down there to really engage youth with credible messengers and the street greeters and activating things. But the youth were there too, and so I was talking to them and said, what would make a difference to you? And I learned that we had made a lot of promises around employment and summer employment, and we didn't follow through. A number of them had gotten to the point where they applied and then didn't get the jobs. So I think we really have to make a promise to those kids and then deliver on that promise. It's one of the things that led me to say that for Seattle Public Schools, if you graduate from a Seattle Public School, you will get 2 years of college tuition to any community college. We've got to fix the opportunity gap so more kids get there, and there's a ton of work to do there. But I think we have to make a promise to those kids that we will, if they deliver, we will deliver.
Sorry. So I think this is another one of those areas where the city has taken a top-down approach, and we need to listen to communities more and educators more. We, through the Families and Education Levy, have a nice chunk of money set aside. It's a great levy. It does good work, but I think the city keeps too tight a control over how the money is spent. So we need to work with educators, the Seattle Public School System, the SEA, and the community groups that understand what programs are most effective, and listen to them and use our resources to support them. So some schools really need help with medical care in the school system. Others are really focused on arts and education after school. Some are focused on mentoring programs. I think we need to work with the school system to identify the most effective programs for each population, each school, and make sure we're also continuing to fund the other programs like Career Bridge and pre-apprenticeship programs that are helping kids get ready for what comes after school.
Okay, before we go to another question, we've been asking for the last 2 weeks for listeners to KVRU 105.7 FM to send us your questions. Because this is a radio program, we can't have people from the audience, taking a minute to get to the microphone and so forth. So we've gotten a lot of questions from the listeners, and one of them that I'd like to ask now has to do with HALA. The new regulations about housing. And the question has to do with the loss of older buildings that are one of the few places where people can find affordable rents in the city. I happen to know that before World War II, over 70% of all the multifamily apartment buildings in the city of Seattle were owned or operated by Japanese Americans. And they lost all of that when they had to go to the concentration camps. So it's very personal for me. But those old buildings that were built in 1920s, 1930s, even some that were built in the 60s, and even 70s, are being demolished by developers to build upscale housing that good working people in Seattle cannot afford to live in. So the question is, now that we have HALA and the MHA, so what are we going to do about the rapid loss of those affordable housing units?
So this is the challenge of HALA, because we're basically limiting our production of affordable housing that we desperately need to what the developers want to do. And that's kind of a key flaw in the system. And we really need to look at all the other tools for building affordable housing, working with community groups to make sure we're doing it in a precise way, not a blanket upzone across the whole city, or not a blanket upzone in every urban village, but let's work with the community on what will work for their neighborhood. And I think we can do a lot better with preserving the naturally affordable apartment buildings. But we need to intentionally go into each neighborhood and understand the specifics of that neighborhood before we make one blanket solution. Because I think, urban growth is happening in our city, people are moving here, but unless we figure out how to make room for them in a way that protects and preserves what we love about this city, we are going to lose our creative soul, we're going to lose our cultural character, and we're going to lose this naturally affordable housing that we already have.
So this is a great question, and actually I've been out walking various neighborhoods in the campaign. I've done about 24 neighborhood walking tours, and usually end the tours meeting with small business employees. And one of the things I hear over and over again is, how do we preserve, and particularly these commercial districts that have these older historic buildings that mean so much to people? And often those are the buildings that are also the affordable housing, the old apartment buildings. So I think we have to do a few things. First, more broadly, as buildings come down, I think the city has to have a greater push to include the affordable housing in the buildings the developers are building, not just to pay in the fund so it's located somewhere else. We've got to try to keep that affordable housing. We've got to keep it in the neighborhoods and throughout the city. The second thing we have to do is really in each neighborhood to identify those areas and those buildings we want to preserve, and have different ways they either can have the air rights above it or they preserve it in some way. And the third is, I can't get to the third because it's time to stop.
Can you use an extra minute here?
Okay.
Go ahead.
Sorry, my mother is calling me on my phone. Process.
So I think that we're not hitting this problem at the right level. We have a serious problem in our housing market right now where this is not natural and normal for housing prices to be rising this quickly and so detached from the incomes of people who live here. Yes, we have growth. Yes, we have people moving in from outside, but we also have speculation happening in our housing market because we are growing, because housing prices were rising, that invited the whole world to pile on and buy up our housing stock as if it's a commodity, as if it's just another investment. So a lot of the housing is being bought up by private equity firms who are turning it into rental housing, but extracting those rents out of our city back to Wall Street. Some of it is people buying up properties for commercial Airbnb operation. Some of it is folks just investing in our housing as second, third, fourth homes because it's such a great investment. Some of it is people parking money because they're trying to extract their wealth from some other country. We've got to look at this dynamic in more detail, and we've got to block this activity, or we're going to continue to see housing prices rise completely out of reach for the people who live and work here.
All right, Jessen, do you have one more question?
Sure. This is a question about the budgeting process, and we can file it under maybe more Seattle process decisions. So one of the things I'm really interested in a political leader is, do they have guts and are they willing to make tough decisions? And I think the budgeting process is a place where that happens because there's finite resources. And in the case of Seattle, the next mayor will be having to look at things like investing in the Burt-Gilman Trail missing link, which has a lot of stakeholders who are very invested in it, but the critique, of course, is that you're investing in one tiny part of town a lot of money. There are other issues around, do you give employees of the city raises who had foregone raises during the recession? There are all of these pressures in the budgeting process, and I'm curious about what principles are you going to use? Who is going to be influencing your decisions around budgeting? And what happens when you make people mad?
That's a lot in 1 minute.
Yep, you can do it.
So I think I've said many times that we have to use a racial equity lens every time we allocate resources in this city, because we need to correct decades of disinvestment in the South End, disinvestment in communities of color, and we need to catch up. We need to reverse that and invest in the South End, and that's the technique to do it. I think the principles I would use is, first, we have to tighten our belts. I think we've had such an influx of funding in the city. Mike McGinn always said the budget's 25% higher than it was 4 or 5 years ago. So we've got to first look at tightening our belts, understanding how we can get more effective programs scaled up and the ones that aren't working shut down, because we need all the resources we can get to invest in all these solutions we've been talking about tonight. So tightening our belts, inviting every single department to identify strategies to be more efficient, more cost-effective, and then using that additional funding to fund some of the things that we're talking about tonight. And also, I believe, because I'm not taking corporate money, because not working with public affairs consultants and lobbyists, that I will be beholden to the people of Seattle in these budgeting decisions.
So I think you and I, Justin, we've talked about this. I think your budget is a values document, and how you spend your money shows what's important. So the first thing the mayor has to do, obviously, is the core city services. There's things that people just expect to happen in a city. Fill the potholes. When you turn on the lights come on, fire service, and that like. But then after that, then you have to start making decisions. And for me, the decisions will always be, how does it help people? So it's going to be the human services things. I'm going to try to protect every way I can, because I think that is the fundamental thing that government can do to help people. The second thing I'm going to be asking is, how does it help the people who have been left out? Because this prosperity in Seattle has not been shared. I had one round table, and someone described it, said, everyone keeps calling it growth, but growth goes this way. I feel like it's this way. It's smashed us. And so I think if you look through the city, there has been a huge part of the city and people who've been displaced and left out. So my next priority is going to be, how do we make up for that? And how do we make their progress and economic opportunity real for community?
All right, and the last question in this round goes to Sharon.
So this is going back to what has been said by a lot of people, the most important issue in Seattle of homelessness. And looking at the intersections of mental health and addiction surrounding homelessness, currently it can take a few months or more for somebody to get into detox or get into treatment. With the recent closures of the recovery centers of King County in South Seattle, how would you address mental health and addiction while addressing the homeless crisis?
That is such a great question, because I don't think you can decouple the two of them. I really think you can't address the homeless issue entirely until you address those issues. And folks may not know this, but right now most of the treatment dollars flow through King County and the shelter dollars go through the city. So I have proposed consolidating those and have a regional approach to it. And again, it's the one area I've said to people that I likely will come back, hopefully as a regional effort, to get more resources and to ask the taxpayers for more tax money. Because we have a raging opioid crisis on our streets. You cannot go in any part of the city and not see the impacts of it. And we don't have the resources to treat people, and we're not giving them a fair share. You know, there is one methadone clinic in all of Seattle, and it can only treat 1,400 people. We are just condemning everyone else to a terrible life by not having that available. So I will fight hard to taxpayers. I will work with, the partners in Olympia to see if we can get state funding. I think on the opioid crisis, let me just finish up here, there's a good chance we can get national dollars, because it's affecting every community, and it's the one thing actually that I think Congress may be able to rely on, and I've talked to the senators about that.
So on the campaign trail, you meet a lot of people, and one of the most heartbreaking people I met was the woman who's got a son who's addicted, who's homeless. He's living in an RV 2 miles from her home, and she can't get to him, she can't help him, she can't get him into treatment. And just the pain in her face is something I'll never forget. So our state is the worst 50 out of 50 for mental health services. So we have to solve this problem working with our delegation in Olympia. This, tax cuts for the big corporations and trickle down austerity for everybody else is simply not working. We have to build momentum for progressive tax reform so we get funding to provide the resources to these services that we need. I will work with King County and other regional partners to get something on the ballot next year, because we do need to fund these solutions sooner rather than later, and I think they're shaping together a good initiative for next year, and I will definitely be at the table supporting that and pulling for it while we pull for more progressive taxes statewide.
All right, this concludes the first part of our program. We are now going to have both of the candidates make their 3-minute statements, closing statements, so to speak, except that Cary is going to stay for another hour. So Jenny has to leave, so we'll let you go first. You can either use that microphone or this one.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much again to all radio listeners and to people in the audience for this spirited debate. Thank you, Cary. I would very much love to be your mayor, and I hope that we can build a better city together. As I said at the beginning, I think we've got some significant challenges. We have right now a city that has changed and become less equitable every day. And you see it in the pains of the faces, start all over again. The pain in faces everywhere you go in this city as they sit and talk to you. I have sat with people in every part of this town who feel like there's no place for them anymore. You go to the Ethiopian Community Center and they talk about how so many of their community have been pushed out. They want housing for their elders to connect them back up to the community, and they have a trouble because the city's not their partner. All they have is obstacles. We have experienced, I think, in the last 2 administrations, the last 8 years in this city have been too much top-down. We have forgotten about the power of community. We have solutions and community-based solutions throughout this city that the city has not been good partners with. In Rainier Beach, it's the Youth Violence Prevention Initiative, which when I sat down with people, I said, how often does the city come and talk to you about how this is working and how it's doing with the youth? How often does that happen? And the answer was 0. It's like they fund it, they disappear, and then they don't care. If I'm mayor, that's going to change. You look at El Centro de la Raza. It is a fabulous community-based place. A school once taken by Roberto Maestas to say, this is our place. And they've made it their place. But they didn't do it with that much help from the city. The city fought them and said, no, that's not the kind of housing we want. But they pushed on and persevered. And now it's a fabulous anchor for that community. We can replicate that in the Filipino Community Association. We can replicate it in the Ethiopian. And we can represent it throughout this town. But we're not empowering the community or listening to the community. And if I'm mayor, I will do everything I can to continue listening. And that means also holding me accountable. Because mayors can't get stuck in City Hall. What they have to do is keep going into the community and get the tough questions. Sometimes get the boos. You know, that's part of doing the job. And that's what I want to be if I'm your mayor. And I want to say one last thing. You've heard a lot of talk up here and questions. Rightfully, people are like, oh, she's the business candidate. I think that does a real disservice to the people supporting my campaign, and particularly to the many, many unions and their workers who are supporting me. The dock workers, the firefighters, the nurses, the women who are providing the mental health treatment to the homeless. You know, I sat down with them before they gave endorsements, and they asked me some of the same questions. And they decided I was the person who could fight for them. And I will fight for them, because I want this city to be the city that my kids can be as proud of and love as much as I have loved Seattle. So please support me as your mayor. Thank you for being here. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you very much, Jenny Durkan. Thank you for coming, and I'm sorry you have to leave.
Yeah, I'm very sorry I had a family engagement.
All right, Cary, you have 3 minutes to give your statement.
Oh, I thought we were going to keep talking.
Well, we are, but you're going to make your statement after her statement.
Okay.
Sorry.
So, thank you all for coming out tonight. This kind of dialogue about the future of our city is really important, and I'm so glad at how many people are engaged, how many people care, how many people are putting forward solutions, because this is how we build the city we know we need for the future. In this time of Trump, when we are watching in dismay and anger at how many good things are being dismantled and how many scary things are building momentum, rising in power, we know we need to do something. I think this change that we're talking about tonight is happening across the country. Citizens are rising up, residents are rising up to say, we need to save democracy. We need to get into the halls of power. We need to change who has power so that we can lock down the institutions and the systems that build a city, a society that is healthy, that is inclusive, that is fair, that is just for everybody. And I'm proud to be part of this movement. I'm proud to be one of 15,000 women who decided in January to run for office, because it's time for all of us to step up. So in this city, I believe we really need at this time to confront openly and every single day systemic racism and how it works. We have gone for too long thinking that because we're liberals, because we don't have the KKK here, we're fine. But we're not fine. Look at the outcomes that get worse and worse every year. Look at increasing wealth inequality, that we used to be the #1 city in the world for African American home ownership. Now we are 5th worst. We used to have 70% of our CD was African Americans. Now it's 17%. Our housing affordability crisis is hurting so many of our friends and neighbors and family members, but there are people who are benefiting. There are corporations who are benefiting off of this crisis. So we need different kind of leadership that's ready to stand up to corporations, that's ready to say, nope, the more corporations own our building stock, own our city, own our businesses, the more this city is going to feel like an office park. And we need to stand together and say no to that. We need to focus on local ownership, local community building, local projects designed by the community, supported by the city, funded by the city, because that's how you build wealth that stays in community, that builds intergenerational security and resilience. We lost sight of that. We treat the economy like it's just the weather, like it's something that happens that we don't quite understand and we're all victims of it. Certain people are benefiting tremendously and the rest are falling behind. We have to acknowledge that the economy is a man-made system. We control it. We, the people, control it. And we need to put in the right structures to stop this concentration of wealth, concentration of power, and reclaim authority for the future of our city with local ownership, with local power, with local solutions, and a mayor's office that's committed to making that happen. So that's the mayor I want to be. That's the way I want to work with community, and I hope I have your vote, and I look forward to working together with you for the future.
Thank you. Cary Moon. So now we're going to do something a little bit different.